Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joined up. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry, plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all kinds of creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend. Right, cue that cheesy theme tune.
Put down your pen and stop your typing. Grab yourself a drink, 'cause it's Joined Up Writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly, it's episode 99 and an interview with debut novelist Lillian Li. Her book, Number One Chinese Restaurant, is already picking up loads of critical buzz, and she's had a really interesting personal story behind her journey to publication, as well as loads to say about plotting and the joy of writing. Before we crack on with that, a little bit about what I've been up to. Last time I gave you an update, I was bemoaning the struggles associated with trying to work on multiple projects at the same time, and I sort of came to the conclusion that I was still going to try to keep my fiction and non-fiction projects going, but with the proviso that I'd planned specific times to spend on each, rather than just winging it, as and when I get some free time. So over the past couple of weeks, I've refined that a little bit further, thanks to a couple of things. Firstly, I've been doing morning pages, and for those of you who've never heard of that, it's something that originated in Julia Cameron's book, The Artist's Way, and the idea is to do 3 pages of longhand writing every day. And I don't mean 3 pages on your work in progress or anything structured, but 3 pages of basically stream of consciousness, whatever flows out and whatever's on your mind. It's for your eyes only, and you shouldn't read over the previous day before starting the next. Just open your journal or notebook and write. Do it in the morning. The clue's in the title, morning pages. And for me, it's like a written form of meditation, and as soon as I started to do it, my mind felt clearer, my mood improved, and I've definitely been more productive with my own writing projects. So I want to thank Maria Smith for suggesting it to me again, as I know she's been finding it useful for some time, and I'll put a link in the show notes to a short video on Julia Cameron's website that gives you a better overview of that. Secondly, I've been rereading Jessica Abel's book, Growing Gills, How to Find Creative Focus When You're Drowning in Daily Life, and I can't recommend it enough. It's based on workshops that Jessica has run over a period of time with creatives across a range of disciplines, and it's full of practical tips and advice. One of those concepts is idea debt. And as I read about it, the penny kind of dropped for me, and that's definitely something that I struggle with. An idea debt is when you've got loads of creative projects that you'd like to do, or that you've thought about, you've planned, or you've started, but you allow them to just kind of hang around in your subconscious, thinking things like, yeah, I will get round to writing that screenplay or radio drama or comic or painting that painting or whatever it is, making that film or whatever it is. And over a period of time, they kind of weigh on you and negatively impact what you're working on in the moment. So the first step is just to write all of them down on a piece of paper, and through a process of asking certain questions, you work through them, taking them away until you work out what you really have to work on right now. And that's the project that you should be focusing on. Now, obviously, I'm simplifying it for brevity here, but it's incredibly useful, and it's helped me realise that my main focus right now should be the non-fiction project that I've mentioned before. And so that's where my writing time's being spent at the moment. And in the past week, I've been more productive than I've been in the past couple of months, so it's definitely working for me. So that's morning pages and growing gills, and I'm currently in the process of trying to arrange an interview with Jessica, so look out for that. Right, I'll be back for a brief word a bit later and to give you a recommendation for a YouTube channel I think you should subscribe to, but let's get going with today's interview with Lillian Li. So Lillian is the author of the novel Number One Chinese Restaurant, now released everywhere you can find books. Her other work has been published in the New York Times, Granta, Guernica, Glimmer Train, Bon Appetit and Jezebel. She lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we started off by comparing our miserable January weather experiences. Okay, Lillian, thanks so much for joining us on Joined Up Writing. I really appreciate it. So why don't you start off by telling us where you are, first of all, in the world and how things are going?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am out in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And right now we're in the middle of Michigan winter, so it's very cloudy, it's very cold.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how things are on your end, but it's a little depressing out here right now.
Yeah, January is horrible, isn't it? Beginning of January is always pretty miserable. I'm guessing it's probably colder where you are than it is here, but I don't know. It's about 5 degrees here at the minute.
We'd have to translate that into Fahrenheit.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, I don't know what it is. Yeah, I have to do the maths. Let's just say it's cold. Yeah, that's good. So why don't you start off by just telling us about your debut novel, Number One Chinese Restaurant? How did the story come about, and can you remember your sort of initial inspiration for it?
Yeah, happy to. So, for those who aren't familiar, Number One Chinese Restaurant takes place in an upscale Peking duck restaurant outside DC, and it basically looks at the lives of the family that owns the restaurant, the Hans, as well as their longtime employees. And what happens one summer when a tragedy suddenly befalls this but beloved establishment, and suddenly this, in many ways, this working family has to find a way to get their lives back in order. And in some ways, I shy away from this sometimes, but I did happen to work as a waitress at an upscale Peking duck restaurant outside DC. So there's definitely a really strong inspiration from that experience. However, I'm also really quick to say that I only worked in that restaurant for 4 weeks.
It's obviously enough. Sometimes that's all it takes.
Right. So, as much inspiration as it was, I think that ultimately the fictional restaurant, the Beijing Duck House, is of my own imagination. Although my parents certainly gave me a lot of, a hard time for quitting so early. They said, if you'd lasted 3 months, imagine you could have written maybe a TV series about this.
I don't know, because sometimes I think what makes us sometimes more effective as writers is when we're kind of the outsider, and obviously the danger is if you had have stayed there for a long time, you might have become sort of institutionalized and you might not have been able to write about it as effectively. So you could use your imagination and take it to places that you probably you wouldn't have expected. Maybe with that short stay there, maybe it worked out better.
Yeah, I really do think that, especially for the kind of writer that I am, which is at times, not as confident in my own imagination as in, the kind of solidity of real experience and real things. I think that if I had lasted longer in that restaurant, I would have ultimately written something closer to like a memoir, because I would never have thought that something that I made up could supersede, my actual experience. And then I think there'd be some potential legal issues with that. So I think, in the end, I'm really glad that I wimped out after less than a month.
I think so. And I think you're right, though. I think that's true. I mean, of a lot of people that actually write memoir, or they adapt a real life story, sometimes they sort of let that get in the way of telling the story in the best way that they can, just for the sake of as you say, actuality and reality and all those kind of things. But sometimes it's not as effective as a story, the shape of it, because real life doesn't usually follow the story structure, does it? It doesn't work out neatly in real life. Things tend to be a bit messy and complicated and multiple characters. So that's an interesting kind of take on it, really. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up and how you came to write in the first place?
Yeah, so I grew up also outside DC in Maryland, and I really came into writing in, I think, a slightly unorthodox way, which was that when I was a kid, I discovered something called fan fiction. And do you know what fan fiction is? Is that something you're familiar with?
I do, but for our listeners, there may be some listeners out there that don't. So just explain what kind of fan fiction you wrote.
Yeah, absolutely. So fan fiction is essentially if you're really obsessed with like a TV show or a book or even like cereal mascots, you can just make a story out of these characters that you kind of borrow or steal from these, already existing, genres. And for me personally, I think what drew me into fan fiction was actually Harry Potter. So that was the very first fan fiction I ever wrote. And I think it was because, you'd have to wait a couple of years between every, volume of Harry Potter. And so when you're a kid, you're so impatient for that story and you are so in love with these characters that, for me at least, I couldn't help but start to write, chapters upon chapters of,
new
not just the
adventures.
main characters, but also like the B characters, the side characters that you barely ever see. I think I have an entire, fanfic about Seamus, who is such a minor character. And I think that was really my first, entree into writing. And I was probably about 10 years old when I started. And I wrote, predominantly fan fiction all the way up until I was 17. And those, stories still exist somewhere on the web. I have found them. And I don't have the heart to take them down. But
well, no, they document a time in your life. And obviously you enjoyed doing it, and it kindled your passion in creative writing. So it's great.
Yeah, I think, certainly, I think writers are really dramatic about the writing process. And we can be, very, at times, emo about, how hard it is to write. But I think that, there is, for me, luckily, always this kind of sense of play and pleasure. And I think I definitely credit that to just the serendipity of having found writing through fan fiction, which is so imbued with just, joy and like excitement. The whole point of writing it is just because you're having the most fun with these worlds, with these stories. So I think, I count myself very lucky that even in my most dramatic, depressive moments, I think there's still that glee of, playing with these dolls almost inside of a dollhouse of my own creation.
Yeah, absolutely. So when did you you thought to yourself, because presumably for all that time you thought, well, this is a fun thing to do and I like doing it in my spare time or whatever, and you obviously like to read because you were reading Harry Potter and that's kind of where the fan fiction sprang from. So when did it get to a point where you thought, hang on, this might be something that I want to do, in other parts of my life? I love words and I want to do something with writing.
I think that, I definitely thought that writers were in some ways extinct, which was a very strange thing to think, considering the fact that I was reading living writers at the time. But I really did think that, maybe as a profession or as a practice, all the writers that once were now, dead and gone. And so that wasn't something that you could really do with your life and with your time, except when maybe you carved out a couple of hours when you should be doing homework or you should be, playing with your friends. So I think for a long time, writing was never, in more than in the margins of my life. And I want to say that in some ways it was my high school that inadvertently, I think, put me onto this path. I went to this all-girls schools in DC, and they had, as part of, their programming, these fellowships that would send you to essentially these summer college prep courses, which as an overachieving student, I wanted more than anything, because I thought, that's really going to set me up for success in this life. And so one of those programs that I desperately wanted was actually one that would send me to do a summer at, I think, Oxford in England. And I wanted to study, I believe, economics. I didn't even know what economics were. I just thought that sounds like a professional thing that a professional person would do. And so, of course, my application for this fellowship was, pretty junky, just because it was very clear that I had no idea why I even wanted to go beyond, the name appeal of it. But within that application, they also had me write a sort of more creative personal essay. And, I think I wrote something about the hidden bookshelves in my life. So, if I think the idea was that if a thief were to steal into my home and for some reason look at my bookshelf, they would see like one version of me. And then there were all these other bookshelves that were hidden around my life, underneath my bed and in the basement and all that fun stuff. And when I turned in that application, I had, English teachers coming up to me and saying, "We really loved your essay. That's really fantastic." And I just thought, I'm a shoo-in for this fellowship. I'm going to Oxford. And no, they did not give me the fellowship because I
You were
clearly
going for the wrong thing, yeah.
absolutely. But because they were really conscientious teachers, they actually turned me toward this other fellowship that I actually hadn't heard about, that wasn't really widely talked about because it wasn't, as I guess prestigious within my school,
Hmm.
which actually sent me to the Sewanee Young Writers Conference,
Hmm.
which was this high school writing conference for young writers, which I didn't even think could be a thing.
Yeah,
And it
that
was my
sounds
very
great.
first. It was amazing. I don't normally have very good summer experiences in my mind, probably because they were all very like academic
Yeah,
and
yeah.
forced me to, think about economics in the summertime. But, for the first time, I was in an environment that in some ways I was like built for. And I was making friends with, fellow weirdos like me who spent a lot of time alone writing about characters they'd made up. And I think it was just not just the fact that I got to write and feel like a real writer in that summer, but it was also in part all the people I met who I felt got me on a level that no other classmates or friends in my past had gotten me. That I think I realized that, not only did I want to be a writer, but I wanted to belong to a writing community, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I would have killed to have been able to go to something like that at that age as well, because there didn't, there wasn't. I didn't know. I mean, if it was out there, then I didn't know about it near where I lived. But that would have been amazing, because, as you say, often with writing and reading, I mean, probably to a certain extent, even more so for men and boys, academic. I mean, I'm not sure about in America, but certainly in the UK at times it's kind of reading and writing and being academic is not kind of, when you're at school and you're at a certain age, I'm not talking about university or whatever, but before that, it's kind of seen as almost a sissy thing to do or something. Why do you like words? Why do you like reading? Why are you reading? It's like the old Bill Hicks thing. Why are you reading? Not what are you reading? Why are you reading? So, and so you kind of keep it to yourself if you like reading and you like spending time in the library, or you as you say, you like writing stories and stuff. It's not something you kind of brag about because you don't tend to get too much kind of cred from it.
Right. No social capital.
Yeah, no, at all. So, I would have killed to have known something like that I could have gone away to and spent some time doing that. So that really fired your passion, did it? And then you thought, this is something I want to. At what point did you think it might be something that you could pursue as a profession?
I think that that's such an interesting question, because I think at this point I'm still wondering if profession is
sure, yeah.
right the right path, or even maybe the right word. And I think that I don't know if you have heard or read the Sigrid Nunez's The Friend, which I think won the National Book Award this year.
No, I haven't.
It's fantastic, and it sort of charts the journey of a sort of middle to late aged writer whose mentor has just committed suicide and left her with his Great Dane to take care of. It's really fantastic, but within it, there is this question of, is writing a profession or is it a vocation? In the way that being a nun is a vocation rather than a profession.
Well, I think it's becoming more that way, just from the point of view that it's very, very difficult to make a living just from writing books. Certainly, I mean, you can write and you can teach, and you can do other things around books and writing and journalism or whatever it is. But actually, from the idea of making a living as, say, a novelist now is it's very rare, isn't it?
And I think that in some ways the joy of writing for me was in some ways feeling like I was kind of pulling one over on like polite society, right? Like instead of doing the work that I was supposed to be doing or socializing the way I was supposed to be socializing, I was doing the sneaky little thing of spending a lot of quiet time by myself, which, was largely frowned upon. And so I almost wonder if for me, I think when I have these like vast expanses of time to write, like when I was in graduate school and I had that permission and the time and the funding to do it, it almost felt less, like a pleasurable activity, like something that I would want to do for many years and years. I think those 3 years were really important and helped me, start and finish this book. I don't know if I would have been able to do that without the support of the program. But I think, having that experience is not necessarily one that I would want to return to, because I think it did turn writing into something that was a little bit more like making
homework almost.
Yeah, exactly. Homework, or like making a cabinet. I think is a metaphor I've heard before. And so I think that even though I know a lot of people who have fantastic work ethic and can write for all those hours of the day and need all those hours of the day, I'm finding that I might exist a little bit better as a writer if I have another profession that I'm seeking out. But I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out. So I might do a complete 180 once I get, like a 9-to-5 job and realize that it, sucks all the creativity out of me. So you're catching me in a very formative transitionary mode.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, as I speak to you, as this podcast goes out, your debut novel will have just been released. And I mean, this goes out on February 12th. So your book, I think, here will be out on February the 7th. Is that right?
Yes, right.
So it'll have been out a few days. So as you say, that one of the things I was actually going to ask you about was, what are the sort of challenges and benefits and opportunities that you've kind of experienced of being a debut author?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am definitely somebody who you might call over vigilant. So I think that if I can, think of every worst case scenario that's going to pop up in the next 6 months to a year, I'll be able to control my future, which is something that I'm working on, because I don't think that's actually true. And so I think the first 6 months to a year before the book came out in the US, which was back in June, I was, I think, at my most high strung, my most overwhelmed, because I was just thinking of a reality that I had not experienced. And so therefore everything that I was thinking up was actually in many ways, totally off the chart. I thought that if I didn't have an author newsletter, that I would fail as an author. That if I didn't, work my butt off trying to build Instagram followers, that everything would fall apart. And I really just had no understanding of, how exactly to prepare for a debut and what exactly promotion was, because that's not something they teach you in grad school. But maybe they should. I don't know. That seems a little insufferable to take a social media class.
I don't know. It's probably useful nowadays, as you say. Prepares you for life, the real life of being a kind of working writer.
Right. And I think in some ways what prepared me for that life ended up being this part-time job that I got a couple of months before I actually sold the book, which was at the indie bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Literati bookstore, where I'm still a part-time bookseller. And I think, during that period of time before the book came out, where I was just on red alert all the time, the only time I think that I could calm down was when I was working in that bookstore, because that was something tangible and real and within the industry, so to speak, that wasn't, locked inside my imagination. I could see what real readers were like, and they weren't the monsters inside my head who were pointing out, every clunky adverb I had stuffed in. They were really passionate, excited people who were actually really generous about the books they read and gave books a lot of chances before being disappointed by, what was written. And, of course, being around my coworkers, they all got advanced copies of my book. And so one after another, they all read it. They all, enjoyed it. Some of them really responded to it. So just seeing those reactions, that also helped, banish some of my imagined reader responses from my head as well. And I think just, being around all of these other books that had come out, that had done well or not as well, but still existed inside this bookstore, existed with the potential to be opened up and read. I think just being around physical books and physical readers was what ultimately prepared me for the book to come out, and had really kept me sane during a time where I think I was like very close to going a little bit crazy. So it's not the most useful advice to say that you should work in a bookstore if you have a book coming out, but if you can, I would highly recommend it.
I should imagine it is useful. Well, yeah, you say you say that it's not useful advice. I mean, I appreciate that not everybody can go to work in a bookstore, but what do you think you learn about, because I've heard this before and I've read it a lot of times before from authors that say, if you really want to learn about promotion and book promotion, and as you say, readers and an audience, then speak to a bookseller or speak to somebody that works in a bookshop that's passionate about books. So what do you think, having worked there for a while, what sorts of things have you learned? What sorts of things have you picked up about that, just in general, about book promotion, and what readers kind of identify with, and what makes you get passionate when you speak to customers that come in? Because presumably there are certain books that you're passionate about and that you talk to customers about. So kind of what makes that connection for you?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. And I think it's definitely something that I've low-key been thinking about a lot just through my years. I worked at this bookstore for just about 3 years now. And I think that within those 3 years, I've learned a lot about, the impact that any individual bookseller can have. But I'll get to that in a second, because on the question of what, maybe I've learned about readers' tastes, I think that's a really important thing that I learned, which is that, part of being a bookseller is you're always hand selling books that you really love and trying to maybe match the tastes of whatever customer you are talking to. So you always ask them maybe a handful of books they enjoyed or didn't enjoy, so you can find those themes. And, it's a really simple discovery for me, but in some ways it's something that I think only feels simple after you've internalized it, which is that truly, every reader has their own, like, very individual, very personal taste. And I think it's really hard sometimes as a writer to not take it really personally when somebody doesn't respond to your work. I mean, it feels like a real rejection of, if not yourself, then your ideas and what you think is important.
Of course, yeah.
And that can be really hard. But I think that when you're on that side as the bookseller, seeing reader after reader after reader, really passionate readers, but also really different kinds of readers, you start to actually internalize this fact that it is not personal to you. It's personal,
no, of course not,
to them. And so, of course, when, one's book comes out and you get those responses, on the internet or in reviews, it's really easy to think that, one statement is a blanket statement that all readers are responding to. But I think, that experience as a bookseller has helped me, like, truly understand that one person not liking your book is just one person not liking your book because of, so many of their own experiences, their own tastes.
Yeah, and genre preference and all sorts of different things. As you say, some people don't like crime books, or some people don't like comic books or romance or whatever it is.
Right. And also how your taste really evolves the more you read and the more years of reading that you've done, or just what has been going on so far. Because I think that one of the questions that all the booksellers at my bookstore really struggle with from customers is like, find me a novel that's happy. Like, we don't.
Right, yeah.
And actually, every single bookseller draws a blank. Like, I'm so glad that Les won the Pulitzer this year, because like, that's a happy book, and I can put that in people's hands. But before that point, I was just like, oh crap, I don't read happy books anymore, because I think that at a certain point that your taste starts to like go towards the darker after a while. I don't know why that is. It just seems to be the case.
You're right though, because I'm the same, and I mean, to be honest, I'm the same. Although I do like comedy, I watch quite a lot of comedy in terms of stand-up comedy, and I do watch some comedy films, but still my preference really is for darker themes. It's not so that I can be depressed or anything else. It's just I am drawn to those kind of, whether it be, in TV, it's things like Breaking Bad or Sopranos or those kind of things, and and to a certain extent, writing, just exploring certain themes. And I think some of it, I mean, at least for me, I think it's escapism, but in a different kind of escapism, because some people want escapism that is, as you say, it's happy and they want to get out of their situation. They just want something that's very, very happy. But for me, it's escapism in terms of I'm very far removed from lots of those worlds. You know, I'm not, fortunately, I'm not hanging around with meth heads and drug dealers and the Italian mafia or whatever. But so to experience those worlds a little bit and get an idea of what they go through, and you know, plus all the other universal themes, that's kind of how we experience it, I suppose, is through film and TV and books.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, your taste for moral ambivalence, I think starts to develop in the same way that when you're an adult, you can drink coffee, but when you're a kid, it just tastes like the grossest
that's a good analogy,
thing.
actually. Yeah.
And it feels sometimes with like reading that there are certain kinds of writing and stories that become more palatable, maybe the more stories that you've read. And so just understanding like where each reader is coming from and what each reader's, you know, personal palette is at that point in their lives is really helpful to depersonalize, you know, the writing side of things.
Absolutely. And have you met, since you've been working at the bookshop, have you met other authors? Have you had other authors coming in to talk about their books and all those kind of things? Have you had events and things like that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So Literati definitely has, you know, a really jam-packed events calendar, especially, you know, in the fall when all the big books are coming out. So we've had really amazing authors come through. We had Jonathan Franzen come through just about a month ago. And we had, now I'm blanking on the people, but Leslie Jameson came through, and I actually got the chance to do a Q&A with her. So that's been actually something that I never would have anticipated for myself, because I really dislike public speaking. And so having a public conversation feels like even higher stakes.
Yeah, sure.
But I've, you know, been able through the bookstore to get a chance to do a Q&A with, you know, Chloe Benjamin, whose second book, The Immortalist, you know, came out and, you know, was fantastic. Talked to Weike Wang, who wrote Chemistry, another really amazing debut book. And so I think, you know, just the chance to see other writers, you know, connecting with an audience and sharing their work definitely shaped my understanding of how to do that with my own events, but also gave me the chance to actually talk to writers that I don't think I would have been face to face with otherwise.
Yeah, and do you think, have you grown as a person as a result of all these experiences? Do you think, in terms of, because you mentioned there that perhaps naturally it's not your favorite thing to do, like, for example, public speaking or, you know, stand up in front of a room full of people or whatever. Do you think it's helping you work through some of those things and making you more confident with that side of things?
Yeah, I think that definitely my very first event was at a writing conference, and it was a very chill panel about research, you know, nothing that you had to prepare for. I was so nervous that I actually couldn't sleep the entire weekend, which made the panel that much harder because I was running on no sleep. But, you know, it went super well because generally the audiences who come to readings are already pretty generous with their time. So they're, you know, they tend to be actually, you know, really great listeners and really active participants. So I think that if I measure, you know, how I feel before events now versus what it used to be, I think that there's definitely been growth. But I think also it's hard. It's one of those things where, because again, public speaking is not natural, even if it's a muscle that I now have developed. You know, it's been a couple months since the book came out in the US. And so now that it's coming out in the UK, I'm feeling kind of like out of shape. If that makes sense.
Well, consider this a small part of your training. That's
I'm sitting right now.
You do some lunges while you talk to me or something. And what would be your advice to? Because obviously there'd be especially this time of the year, there's lots of new books coming out, and there's lots of people that are just about to, in the next 2 or 3 months or whatever, there'll be another big spate of books that will come out. So there'll be lots of people, lots of debut authors that are nervously sitting at home now, biting their nails, worrying about the release of their book. Having experienced it, as you say, a few months ago in the US, and now you're going on to the UK release or whatever, have you got any advice for those people having been a few months on from it now and sort of push through at least the initial wave of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, like I said earlier, a lot of what made me, really kind of spiral in those, months before the book came out was just not knowing what to expect, what was real, and what was just my anxious imagination. And I think that besides the bookstore, what really helped me was I happened, very luckily through, I think, Twitter to find a group of other debut authors. And we, started exchanging emails and talking to each other. And just by kind of sharing information and anxieties with each other, that was really helpful. So certainly finding other people who are coming out with debuts is a piece of advice that I would definitely give. And I think it'd be easy to, just because, again, like everyone who has a debut coming out is probably freaking out right now and would love a community. So it's, like walking into a party where everybody wants to talk to you.
Yeah.
So it's not as nerve-wracking as it might sound. So just like reach out to an author on social media or through email just to be like, hey, I think we're coming out at the same time. Do you want to talk?
Yeah.
But I think that also, what can maybe be also anxiety provoking is if you're just in an echo chamber of debut authors, because they also don't know anything. So.
Yeah, that's true.
So actually, I would also recommend talking to somebody who had a book come out like a year ago.
Yeah.
And they will actually be able to set you straight on what anxieties are real and which ones are imagined. And especially if you're an author who comes from a more marginalized, community, it was really helpful for me to talk to another, female writer of color who came from an immigrant background, who had a really successful book a couple years back. And she could tell me, my anxieties about being stereotyped, my anxieties about how the book was being marketed. She could tell me, what pitfalls she experienced and which ones were ones that actually never really came up at all. So I think that'd be like my two-pronged piece of advice for people.
Yeah, well, that's all really good advice. So in terms of actually, the thing that we sort of haven't talked about yet is how you actually made it to publication in the first place. So tell us, because I think I'm right in thinking that Number One Chinese Restaurant began as a short story, didn't it? Is that right?
Right, that's right. And it was actually, I think, the second short story I ever wrote in grad school. It was in my first semester writing workshop. And it was one of those situations where you have a deadline. And I do really function well on deadlines, I've realized. And I had maybe a week before I had to turn it in. And I had nothing, left over. And so I just thought, well, I've always kind of wanted to write about this Chinese restaurant experience, but I've always been too nervous to, because I only lasted, barely a month. So what have I got to write? But deadline's coming. Who cares? Let's just get this down. And then in the writing of that short story, I realized, hey, I'm actually pretty comfortable within this space, more comfortable than I ever thought I would be. And I'm also incredibly interested in these characters that I've just thrown out onto the page. So maybe I actually want to spend much longer than I realized. And I believe I asked my workshop after they read the short story if I could turn this into a novel, which is a really loaded question. So of course everyone said yes. Like they're
no,
they're not going to crap my dream and then have me talk about it like 8 years later.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I think that was, pretty much when I started writing the novel proper. Although I later found out after, I pretty much wrote for the rest of that first year over the summer. And then I got matched up with a thesis advisor in my second year. And she read my draft. I had maybe 200 or so pages that I was pretty proud of. And I thought that, I was, basically done with my first draft of a novel. And she had to break it to me that, in fact, it was not a novel. It was 200 pages of character sketches.
Right.
And that was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But then she taught me what a plot was and saved my skin. So I'm eternally grateful to this one teacher. Her name's Eileen Pollock. And she helped me build a plot. And actually from there, the combination of character sketches and an actual workable plot made, I think, the rest of the novel writing a lot smoother than what I think it usually will be like.
And what sort, you mentioned there she sort of helped you to build that plot. I mean, I'm not asking you to talk about specifically your plot points. Obviously, I don't want to give any spoilers away so people go out and buy the book. But in terms of how the types of things that she talked about, so presumably it was things like conflict and stuff like that, was it? Give us a sense of the kinds of things that you touched on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in some ways, it was even more tangible than talking about conflict and motives. Although the very first thing that she told me, which I will take, I think, with me forever, is the 200 pages I had written were essentially what I found interesting, which is the characters going through their daily routine lives.
Yeah.
Just like very normal everyday stuff. And she said, like, this is all good and fine, but you have to know that most novels aren't about routine. They're about what happens when the routine is disrupted.
Yeah.
And you write after the disruption. And I was like, oh, damn. That's that's so good and so obvious. So that was number one. And that was when, I came up with the tragedy that befalls the restaurant. Before, there was no tragedy. And I think the second main thing that she taught me, which was so tangible, is to think about plot as a series of 2, 3, or 4 maybe giant dominoes. And in fact, you can probably divide a novel's plot up amongst those 3 dominoes. So you have the first domino, which is some incident that's big enough that when it happens, it sets off enough kind of consequences and reactions that will take up the next 100 pages or so until all of those consequences end up kind of re-finding each other and colliding again and creating that second incident, that second big ass domino that then topples over, creates another set of reactions and consequences until that hit that third last big domino. And if you can figure out your 3 or however many dominoes, that's your plot. And if I went through my email recently just to see if I actually, followed that to a T. And in fact, in my email to her, I have it: domino 1, this happens; domino 2, this happens. And that's pretty much exactly the plot that is in the book.
That's a great way of looking at it. Yeah, it's that initial inciting incident which most people kind of know about, like, as you say, the tragedy or whatever it is that kicks off the whole thing, and the point of no return. But that idea that should lead on to consequence, and then another big consequence that then keeps you going into the next act of the book, isn't it?
Right, exactly. And another thing was that before I came up with my 3 dominoes, I think I had 15 dominoes. That was an earlier email to her, and she said, no, that's way too many. So that's the other thing, is that you can't have too many of those big events, because it, toggles with the stakes for your readers, so that I think every new consequence, if it's immediately settled and a new one is brought in, after a while, your reader is so desensitized to the stakes that it doesn't matter how big your dominoes are. So I think, definitely finding that balance, and also just the image of the dominoes was really helpful for me.
Yeah, and I suppose as well as regarding the last point, you kind of need to create these problems that are big enough that they do take a little bit of time, a certain amount of time to solve, so that, as you say, it's more satisfying and you can spread it out over the course of the whole novel.
Yeah, exactly.
So you did that. So you obviously went back and you drafted again. You came up with another first draft or whatever. So where did you go from that? Did you submit it to an agent or straight to publishers, or was it through another contact? How did that come about?
Yeah, so I got an agent probably around April of my fellowship year, so my 3rd year within the program. And by the time I found my agent, Adam Eaglin, I was, pretty certain that the draft was done and that we would submit it to editors immediately. But part of the reason, actually, I think that I picked Adam as my agent, so I found him. He was actually a friend of a literary agent that I had met through an old creative writing professor. And she was leaving, New York, leaving literary agency. And so she actually recommended Adam to me because their agencies shared the same floor within this building in New York. I guess because of how New York real estate works.
Yeah, it's just expensive. Yeah,
into one floor. And he was in many ways a mentor to this agent. And so we kind of got paired up together that way. But I had also, sent my work to agents that the University of Michigan had brought in, my grad school. I submitted to agents who I didn't know. I just cold emailed them because they happened to represent authors that I really loved and respected. So I did, I think all of the the ways that you can reach out to agents, and ended up with Adam because actually he had so many edits that he wanted me to make to my draft that I thought was basically done. And I think just because of how I was raised, I tend to think that the person with the most critiques is the one that I want on my side. Because my parents are fantastic people and fantastic parents, but they were definitely like very tough love. They're very honest with me. So if something wasn't good, they wouldn't, sugarcoat it. And so I've come to want that same kind of relationship with a lot of, things in my life. So Adam provided that. And then we spent another 3 or 4 months, really editing that draft. And then we submitted it to editors towards the end of August. And that was pretty much the journey for me.
I think you're right about the critique and the criticism, though, because although, as you say, especially when you first start out, it can be difficult to deal with critique and criticism. I think anybody that really wants to improve at anything is desperate for critique, objective critique, as you say, from somebody that can actually tell you how to make something better. That's great. I mean, and I think the people that do succeed and get on are the people that kind of recognise that as soon as possible, really. So what sorts of things did you tend to find? What sorts of things was Adam critiquing? What of that what you thought was your first draft, but it was probably your second or your third or whatever anyway, and then you were going to do it's just writing is rewriting. So what sorts of issues were they? Kind of common threads? Was it to do with the plot or characterization or?
Yeah, so I think, what also piqued my interest about Adam was that what he was picking up on were, in some ways, what was not on the page, which revealed, in some ways, a lack of thought, sometimes a lack of confidence in me as the writer. So an almost intangible thing. And the example that I have is that he didn't get this feeling that I knew what these characters' backstories were. Right. So many of the characters in Number One Chinese Restaurant are immigrants, and that means that they had a whole life, a whole family, a whole background and culture that they left behind. And, as a fairly young writer and as someone who is not an immigrant, but is the daughter of immigrants, I think I, really felt both secure and insecure about writing about these characters. And I think my way of hiding that insecurity was just to be very oblique and lied a lot of information, just say, oh, that's just stuff they don't talk about anymore, and doesn't have to be on the page. And Adam can sense that. And so he really wanted me to actually do the research and figure out, where my characters came from and how they even just got their way into America, because that story alone says so much about the character itself. And what's amazing is that, doing that research and spending that time, I don't think actually a lot of their backstories made it into the book, because that wasn't really, I think, what Adam's end goal was.
It was you knowing it, really.
Exactly. And I just felt like that was a critique that could have never anticipated. And it in some ways, it felt not exactly like what an agent's critique even is. I often think about critique as what you have to, do to add to the piece rather than just what you have to add to your own experience with the piece. So he gave a lot of kinds of edits that really got at my insecurities and helped me overcome them, which is fantastic.
And you mentioned that as a child of immigrants, so with some of that, I appreciate probably not all of it, because obviously I should imagine every immigrant story is unique anyway, depending on where they came from and the experience that when they arrived in the country that they arrived in, all that kind of thing. But did you get to draw on much of that yourself from your family's background?
Yeah, I think that definitely, the story has, I think, at least 3 generations. I want to say 3 generations of the family. And so a lot of what I was, mining from my own family experience was just the generational gaps that are, exacerbated by language barriers that I experienced and that I saw my, friends who were also children of immigrants experiencing. And I think that was a lot of what I brought into the piece. So, for example, there is a scene where Nan, who is, the manager of the duck house, she's trying to connect with her son, Pat. He's 17 and he's very troubled. Has just been expelled from high school. And the way that she knows how to show care is that she buys a Slurpee for him, which is, kind of like an icy drink that they have them outside of America. And he, kind of looks at it and realizes like, oh, those are like you got the flavors that are my 2 favorite flavors. And of course, he assumes that was just like serendipity. But in fact, she has been actively paying attention to like the garbage that he throws out. And noticed that Slurpee cups that he throws out has those 2 colors. And that's something that's like very similar to how my mother would show care to my brother, was paying attention to what he ate more of or less of, and then kind of stocking food or buying food to, fit that preference, but never really speaking about it. And him never really, I think, noticing it.
Acknowledging it, You, the writer, did.
Right, exactly. I think like that was my, very like spy moment of like, that's
something that you spotted.
That's something to be spotted.
So you mentioned, earlier, and again, coming from that kind of immigrant background and your parents being, let's say, tough love, they're giving you some harsh criticism, objective criticism, let's call it that. So having, presumably, have they read the book now? What do they think about it? Yeah. So my mother read the book right around the time I think it was going through final edits, because I just really wanted her. So my mom actually worked in a Chinese restaurant when she first came to America. And in many ways, actually, her experience at that restaurant was partially why I decided to go work at a Chinese restaurant, because she always said it built her character and made her tough. And so I was like, I want to be tough. I think that's really why I got that job. And I think I wanted to impress her too. And so of course I wanted her to read this book to see if it felt true to her and her experience. And she read it, very quickly. And when she came back to me with it, she said that it really felt like the people that she had worked with at the restaurant were like had come back alive for her and were like all around her. And so that was, that must have been amazing an amazing moment. Yeah.
And that was like, it was very shocking for me to hear as well, just because I think for a long time my mom was just like, why are you writing about a Chinese restaurant? Like, that's so boring. Like, why don't you write something sexier, something that will sell that Americans like? And so it was really touching to hear that she did resonate with the characters. Although she did say that there's one, I guess like sex scene in there where she thought that they should maybe kiss for a little while before they got down.
That's just normal. That's just normal mum stuff, though, isn't it?
Absolutely. And then my dad, he doesn't really read as much. He doesn't really read as much American literature. He'll read in Chinese. And so he had a hard time actually for a while finishing the book, and he read it fairly, in his words, superficially. And so what he's actually been doing lately is he's actually trying to translate the book into Chinese,
Right.
which was a really crazy endeavor that I didn't expect at all. And I think, he just finished translating the first chapter and he read it to me. And just seeing him kind of engaging with the work, and he would sort of check with me. He was like, I've translated it this way. Is that what you meant with this,
Wow,
phrase, this metaphor? And I was like, that is the deepest reading you can possibly.
So I'm going to say, in a way, he's kind of connecting with it on an even more fundamental level, really.
Yeah, truly. And an interesting byproduct of that is that he has found sort of like weak areas in the language.
Yeah, you need to make this a bit clearer. Yeah.
Absolutely. He's like, what did you mean with this word? And I will think, oh, that was the wrong word to have used. I was just being flowery. So that was a very funny byproduct. But hopefully it improves my writing, his translating.
Absolutely. Well, it certainly gives you a different kind of perspective. And on that subject, are you working? I appreciate you might not be able to tell me exactly what it is, but are you working on something else now? How's that going?
Yeah, so I think that in so many ways, this first book, I feel very, very lucky with how, even though there were, a lot of hiccups and pitfalls along the way, I think it was a really smooth ride all throughout. Pretty much first year of grad school, last year of grad school, it was very neat. And I don't think at any point I felt like this was a project that I wouldn't be able to finish. And so what I am finding now, in the months after publication, of course, this is a time when your mind's really cloudy and cluttered with voices, and you're talking a lot about the book you just wrote, so it's kind of hard to think about something else.
Mm-hmm.
But for, I think, one of the first times I have written failed novels. I've written 3 so far. They've died on me. The first one was, it felt really embarrassing, so I didn't tell people. Second time, it was also hurtful, but I, wanted to tell people because I was so frustrated. And the third, and at this point now, I'm just talking very openly about how many books have failed for me on the table, have died on the table with me.
That's a good way of looking at it. Okay, let's take a quick break there to give you a YouTube channel recommendation that I found inspiring and entertaining in equal measure, which is Lessons from the Screenplay by Michael Tucker. Again, I'll put this in the show notes, and I'd love to get Michael on the show at some point. But these short videos, usually somewhere between sort of 10 or 15 minutes long, are brilliantly written and edited and just packed full with information that writers in any medium will find useful. So you can start anywhere. There's ones on there about Reservoir Dogs and Children of Men, and on it goes. You can check it out. They all include spoilers, so don't watch one if you've not seen the film yet, but I really recommend it. So that's Lessons from the Screenplay. Also, I wanted to remind you to get in touch and let me know what you're up to and what, if anything, you find helpful about the show. And you can do that via email, wayne@waynekellywrites.com, on Twitter @JUPodcast, or by joining the Facebook community. Also, don't forget to take 2 minutes to leave me an iTunes rating and review. It costs you nothing, but makes a huge difference to how many people can find the show, and it just lets me know what you find useful. So, and if you do that, drop me a line or tweet and let me know, and I'll be sure to give you a mention in the show. Right, let's get back to my chat with Lillian Li, where I asked her about previous novels that may have come before her debut. So was Number One Chinese Restaurant, was that your, I know it's your debut novel, but was that your first, is that the first novel that you actually completed writing?
Yeah, it was. And I was trying to write another, what I thought was a novel during the time that I was working at the restaurant. But, just looking back at that was not even, I think at the time I didn't even really believe it would become a novel. So I really do think Number One Chinese Restaurant was one of my very first attempts at a novel, and then somehow managed to be the novel that got published, which I just don't think is very, very likely.
Well, I was going to say, it's often, I would say, most people that I speak to, it's often the case that what becomes their debut novel is often, their third or their fourth novel. And that they'll often, even if they've actually completed other novels, they might have completed 3 novels before it's the fourth one that's actually that they consider good enough, and the one that actually makes it to the next level
Yeah.
for whatever reason. It's almost like, they're practicing. But obviously you were writing for a long period of time before that, although they weren't necessarily novels. You were writing all the fan fiction, and you were obviously writing short stories and stuff. And that's and it's still it's still writing. I mean, as you say, novels are a different beast, but obviously you worked through that as part of your academic course that you were doing at the time.
Right.
But
right.
So in terms of, so you've had those, as you say, those three that have kind of died on the table, and how do you feel about it now? Have you got another one that's on the go, or you've just the third one's just died?
Yeah, so I think that maybe there's a fourth one, and it's actually an old idea so in some ways I feel like they could potentially, these three dead ones might reincarnate at some point, so maybe that's why
nothing is wasted. Yeah.
But I think that I read this Ray Bradbury quote, which is a bit lewd, which is why I love it, but he talks about the reason why writers are kind of reluctant sometimes to talk about the novels that they're working on. Sometimes it's superstition, but oftentimes it's just because it is so hard to sustain excitement and interest in a novel, which is a years-long, hundreds of pages endeavor. And can you imagine being hard for 3 years? And when I read that, I was just like, yes, okay.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
So I think that I'm usually a blabbermouth, but I've decided to see what it's like to keep quiet about my excitement and see if that sustains me.
Yeah, and again, I have spoken to other people that have said that to me before. They'll say, I'm working on something and I'm not going to jinx it, so I'm not telling you about it because I'm not sure yet. They haven't got to the end of the first draft, or they haven't got to a point they consider when they kind of know they're going to finish it. So
right. But
that's interesting, and it's good as you say. I think it's actually good to share those experiences anyway, because I think a lot of people think, I think the reality of it is that everybody, that including all successful published authors or whatever that may be on several books, everybody has got at least one, and usually several, failed novels, or novels that they might have even got to the end of the first draft, but then they've never touched it again. They've not edited it because they just don't think it's good enough, or they're sick of it and they never want to look at it. And there's lots that don't get to lots of people don't get to the end of a first draft anyway.
Right.
I think if you can get to the end of a first draft, that's a massive achievement, and you're much more likely to go on and finish it properly, I think, if you've written the first draft. But I definitely think, for me anyway, I think that's the hardest thing. I mean, I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And in fact, it feels so unfair if you finish that first draft for it to then fail later on, because you've really done all that work to make it viable. But so far, I think for me, all the failed drafts are ones that didn't make it past 200 pages. So I think that's that's still a point where, even though I'm angry, it doesn't feel like the world is conspired against me in the way that I think it would feel if you did all that work to finish that first draft. Has that happened to you before?
What, where I finish the first draft and then it's not, and then I've not done anything? Well, you never say never. I have actually got I've got a novel that I finished a few years ago, and I finished it as in it's a first draft, and it is a really, really ugly, horrible first draft. Particularly the sort of the last sort of 10,000 words, where I was just desperate to crawl across the line and say that I'd finished it. So it was almost a case of, I was almost like writing it almost like reported. It was like, and then this happens, and then that happens, and this person comes, just so that I could get to the end. But I still think I've not abandoned it. I mean, it's a completely different genre to the book that I've just submitted now, that I will hope will one day be my debut novel or whatever, which is crime. But the novel that I'm talking about, that's a completely different genre. It's kind of like almost like an urban fantasy or something, with a bit of it's a bit like sort of Terry Pratchett or Douglas Adams or something like that. It's not high fantasy. It's not. It's set in the afterlife, but it's kind of got comic elements to it. But so I think it's got a good central premise and stuff. Right. But just the idea of going back to it and editing it. And then my other thing is with it, and I've spoken to another author about this recently, but is that if the novel that I'm submitting at the moment, if by some miracle that does get picked up at some point, they will not want this other novel anyway, because because this is a crime novel that I'm submitting at the moment.
Yeah.
So if I say to them, "Well, this novel's in a completely different genre," the chances are they will not want it. What they'll want is another book that's in the same genre, not necessarily a series. Although I am working on a second book that does kind of follow on, but they will want it to at least be in the same ballpark. So all of that take all of that into account. I haven't got the motivation to go back and trawl through like 100,000 words or whatever it is and edit the thing and shape it into something. But as I say, it's still there. It's not going anywhere. It's still on my hard drive, and I'm sure I'll go back to it at some stage.
It just seems like with, the amount of time that has passed, as much as there will be things that make you cringe, I feel like there will also be a lot of things that you forgot that you wrote that are like genius, and you're going to feel like so amazed.
I think you're right. I do think you're right. I feel like that about first drafts in general, because I think you're right. You get to a point, I mean, that's why they always say, don't they, leave it for a while. You finish the first draft, at least give it like a few weeks minimum.
Right.
And I think you're right. You start reading it, and it's kind of a roller coaster, because you'll read certain bits and you think, oh my God, this is amazing. I can't remember writing this. This is, where did I come up with this? Oh, this is really good. And then you hit the next scene and you're like, oh my God, this is absolutely terrible. I don't know why it's in there. I don't know what I was thinking, but it's kind of this whole thing. I don't know whether you're the same when you going through those initial rewrites.
Oh yeah.
You're trying to shape the thing. But, yeah, it is. It's a strange thing that we do, because on the one hand, we've got this massive. It's almost like this massive ego that what I write is good enough for other people to read. I want other people to read it, but then you're constantly plagued by self-doubt, and you just think the whole thing's rubbish. So it's a really unusual mix, I find.
Very sadomasochistic.
It absolutely
state of mind.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. But we keep doing it. We keep doing it itself. We still enjoy it, so it's a perfect description, really. You're right, we're sadomasochists, so but we'll keep doing it. So so I think that's a good place to, sadomasochism is as good a place as any to wrap things up.
It's a fantastic place.
So where can people find more about you and your work online and connect with you on social media?
Yeah, so my website is lillianliauthor.com, and my social media handles are just at ZillianZ, so just my name, but with Z's at the fronts.
I see, yeah.
And that's pretty much, I think, where you'll find me. And if you're ever in Ann Arbor, if you drop by Literati Bookstore, I'll probably be there as well. Happy to recommend books to you that aren't mine.
Good. I like it. You've even got a plug for the shop in there. That's brilliant.
I do. They've been selling so many copies of my books. I owe them.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Well, I wish you the very best with the book. It's been really good to talk to you. I'm sure you'll have success with it. And yeah.
Thanks for working me out.
Yeah. Personal trainer. I don't know. Yeah, be the world's worst personal trainer, especially after Christmas and all the cakes and beer that
I'm really excited about both of your books, and I'll just be keeping my ears pricked.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. That's very kind of you. All right, Lillian, that's brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us, and appreciate it. And good luck with the book.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks again to Lillian Li. Really enjoyed that interview, and her debut #1 Chinese restaurant is available everywhere you can get books, and I'll put all her links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That pretty much wraps things up for another week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts to have the show downloaded automatically every week. Next time, it's a bit of a milestone, episode 100, where I'll be talking to John Lincoln about his new crime novel, Fade to Grey. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing and reading, and I'll see you next time.
Joined up